What's up, enthusiasts? Last week I posted some gameplay footage with the FabuStrike. Now this has a BlasterTECH kit inside of it, and I filmed the installation process for this particular kit in hopes of making an installation guide for those of you considering purchasing one and wanting to know what installing one is like. Now unfortunately, thanks to a combination of missing footage, corrupt footage, and footage I just plain forgot to film, it's not quite the way I want it to be, but I didn't want the footage to go to waste, so I thought I'd make it a brief installation video in hopes that it provides you with some information of what the process is like. To get started, we open up the blaster and remove all the non-essential parts and put them to the side. After that, we want to remove the existing wiring loom by unscrewing the screws holding down the motor housing, wire cover, pusher mech, switches, and trigger cluster. This should leave the shell of the blaster essentially empty. From here, we need to prep the shell for the new parts that are going in. This means removing the plastic ribs in certain locations with a Dremel or snipping tool and making sure they're sanded smooth so no rough edges causes issues with the wiring. Once the shell and pusher mech are prepped, it's time to put the new switch plate in, and when you place it in, it should be firmly in place and the wire should be running in the space created when prepping the shell. Getting everything to sit properly in place can take some time, so don't get frustrated if it doesn't just pop perfectly into place at first. And once you have that in place, you can hot glue it to secure it, but don't use anything that's permanent in case you need to remove it in the future. In fact, I didn't secure mine at all, as the fit seemed snug enough as it was. With that in place, make sure the pusher rod is completely retracted and we can put the pusher cutout microswitch up against the pusher rod, making sure that the microswitch is pressed when in position. You should hear a click when the microswitch is pressed far enough. Once it's in a position you like, you can superglue it into place. Moving on to the flywheels, it's time to remove the rubber dart skirt and pop the cage open. You can cut the wires off and pop the boards of the flywheel cage to get to the motors themselves. I used some pliers to get the motors out, but it took some effort and I damaged the motors themselves in the process. So if you plan to use the motors for something else, you might want to try a different method. After the motors are out though, it's time to Dremel and sand the inside of the motor housings just enough to let the new motors fit, because they tend to not fit as they are. You don't want to go too overboard though, so just Dremel and sand a little bit at a time and check the fit, because you want them snug but not loose. When the housings are sanded to the right fit, put the motors in, making sure the blue wires are on the muzzle side of the flywheel cage. You also want to be careful not to damage the solder on the motors or to push the motor shaft, as that can damage the motor. If you feel like you need to force the motor in too much, then you might want to consider dremeling or sanding a bit more, or make sure you sanded down an even amount around the inside of the motor housing. Once you get the motors in, you can put the rubber retainer straps back on, refit the rubber flywheels, and put the second half of the motor housing back on, making sure that the flywheels spin freely by checking if they spin with your fingers. You can now screw the motor housing back into place without the dart skirt, as it can cause jams, also putting the blue and black wires in the magwell tray and the red wire around the motors to the front of the blaster in the battery compartment. At this point, we need to pop open the original trigger cluster to get the main trigger and acceleration trigger along with their respective springs out. We need to cut and sand off parts of each of these triggers to get them to fit with the new switch plate. We want to do this carefully to prevent cutting too much, so you can go bit by bit if you want to find the right amount. We also want to glue this small piece to the acceleration trigger, making sure the flat side is facing the micro switch. This will give us good contact with the acceleration switch. With all this done, we can finally put the blaster back together. Now keep in mind this kit removes all the electrical and mechanical locks. However, it's not a bad idea to keep one of the old switches with the wire removed and put it in the jam door switch slot, which will help prevent your jam door from opening randomly. Now to test the blaster, you can use 4 AA alkaline batteries in a battery holder, connecting the positive to the red lead of the battery connector and the negative to the black lead of the battery connector. Testing this way can prevent catastrophic failure and still allow you to make sure the motors are working and the pusher mech is pushing in and out properly. And once you make sure everything is working properly, you can put all the extra pieces like sling points and clip releases back in and close the blaster back up. You've now got yourself a shiny modded blaster to take to your next game. Well, that's going to do it for this video. I hope you found this video useful to see what the installation process is like for a BlasterTECH kit. Now, one thing I do want to say is if you're planning on using one of these kits or a blaster with a LiPo battery in general, please practice proper safety with the batteries, as they can be dangerous if mistreated. With that said, let me know what you think of these kits and the installation of them. I'll look forward to all of your thoughts on it. As always, thank you so much for watching. Have fun flinging foam, and I'll see you next time.